Julian Cross had always considered Sophie Lane just another ordinary employee, until she unexpectedly saved him from a dangerous blackmail scheme. But what Sophie didn't realize was that her actions had dragged her into a battle filled with hidden conspiracies. A secret slowly unraveled, and an uncontrollable bond began to form between them. Was Sophie truly just an unknown employee, or was she the only one capable of changing Julian forever? Sophie Lane had been working at Cross Enterprises for over a year. A diligent worker, she always arrived early, met deadlines, and never drew attention to herself. Her colleagues nicknamed her the office ghost because she was so quiet, never attending parties or engaging in meaningless gossip. Julian Cross, the CEO of the company, was a man known for his cold demeanor and ruthless decisiveness. Under his leadership, hundreds of employees worked with precision, leaving no room for mistakes. One thing was certain: he had never once noticed Sophie. To him, she was just another forgettable name on the employee list. On a Monday morning, while organizing files at her workstation, Sophie overheard her colleagues whispering, "I heard there's a major investment deal happening soon. Boss Julian is meeting a mystery investor at the Sterling Hotel tonight." Really? That man never trusts anyone. He keeps himself locked up like an impenetrable fortress. Sophie had little interest in the affairs of the wealthy. She simply continued her work. But she had no idea that by nightfall, fate would push her into a situation that would change her life forever. That evening, Sophie went to the Sterling Hotel to cover a shift for a friend working as a server. While passing through the VIP lounge, she unexpectedly saw Julian Cross stepping into a private meeting room. But something felt off. Her instincts told her this wasn't just a normal business meeting. Sophie hesitated, then discreetly peeked through the slightly open door. Inside, Julian was seated across from three unfamiliar men. One of them placed a folder on the table, his voice smooth yet laced with danger. "Mr. Cross, I believe you wouldn't want these photos making headlines tomorrow, would you?" Julian arched an eyebrow at the folder, his sharp gaze darkening. Sophie's heart pounded. She immediately realized this was blackmail, but what could she do? She was just an ordinary employee. Julian opened the folder, his expression turning to ice as he examined the pictures inside. They were skillfully doctored, showing him in intimate moments with an unknown woman. If leaked, they could ruin his reputation and send Cross Enterprises into turmoil. The man across from him smirked. "All you need to do is sign this contract and transfer a measly $10 million to our account, and this will all go away." Julian crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "You think I'm stupid enough to fall for such a cheap trick?" The man tapped a finger against the folder. "Of course not. But the media doesn't care whether these photos are real or fake. They just need a scandal. And the rest, well, I'm sure you can imagine." Julian clenched his fist under the table, but his expression remained composed. He was already calculating his way out. Outside the door, Sophie froze. She could walk away, pretend she had seen nothing. But her conscience wouldn't allow it. Julian might be cold and distant, but he was an honest CEO who didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. Glancing around, her eyes landed on a waiter pushing a cart of wine. An idea flashed through her mind. 3 minutes later, the VIP room door swung open. A hotel server entered, carrying an elegant tray of expensive wine. It was Sophie, but with her face partially hidden behind a mask and a low-brimmed cap. No one recognized her. "Complimentary wine from the hotel. Please enjoy," she said in a deliberately light and professional tone. The lead blackmailer glanced at her before smirking. "Mr. Cross, looks like you're in luck. Maybe a drink will help ease the tension." Julian studied Sophie for a brief second before slowly accepting the glass. He had no idea who she was, but his instincts told him to play along. Sophie poured wine for the others, subtly placing a small USB drive on the table right next to the folder. Then she whispered under the table, "Check now." Julian's eyes flickered with recognition. Keeping his movements discreet, he reached under the table and felt a tiny recording device Sophie had secretly planted earlier. She had recorded everything. A faint smirk touched Julian's lips. He raised his glass, his sharp gaze carrying an unspoken message. "How interesting, perhaps I should consider your offer after all." Sophie gave the slightest nod before slipping out of the room unnoticed. She knew this was just the beginning. Julian leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, his stormy gray eyes calmly fixed on the three men before him. "How much do you want?" His voice was low, as if he were genuinely considering the offer. The leader smirked. $10 million. A small price for your reputation, wouldn't you say? Julian didn't respond. His fingers brushed against the USB Sophie had slipped under the table, gripping it tightly. Pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind. If this device contained a recording of the conversation, he could turn the tables. But to make his move without arousing suspicion, he needed time. "I'll think about it," Julian said, placing his glass down. "Give me 24 hours. The man raised an eyebrow but eventually nodded. "We'll be in touch. And I hope you're not planning anything foolish." Julian merely offered a faint smirk before rising and leaving the room. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked away, but now he had the upper hand. Outside, Sophie was already waiting in a shadowed corner. As soon as Julian stepped out, she quickly pulled him into a secluded hallway. "That USB has enough evidence to take them down," she whispered. Julian crossed his arms, studying the woman before him. This was the first time he truly looked at her. She seemed ordinary at first glance, but her sharp instincts and fearlessness were anything but. "Who are you?" he asked. Sophie took a deep breath. She knew she had crossed the line of a regular employee, but if she had to do it again, she wouldn't hesitate. "Just one of your employees." Julian let out a quiet chuckle. "A regular employee wouldn't risk this much." "Then maybe I'm not so regular," Sophie replied, her eyes unwavering. Julian held her gaze for a moment before pulling out his phone and calling his trusted assistant. "Prepare an emergency meeting. I have some evidence that needs immediate action." Sophie thought it was over. But she had no idea this was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. Because just as Julian walked out of the hotel, a mysterious text popped up on Sophie's phone. "You've meddled in the wrong affairs, Sophie Lane. Be careful." Her grip tightened around her phone, her heartbeat quickening. A warning, but from whom? The blackmailers? Someone else watching her? She looked up and found Julian still staring at her, his gaze sharp yet unreadable. "What is it?" he asked. Sophie hesitated for a second before deciding to show him the message. If she had already gone this far to help him, there was no point in hiding it now. Julian read the text, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was a flicker of something dangerous in his expression, but his voice remained steady. "Do you get messages like this often?" Sophie shook her head. "No. This is the first time." Julian was silent for a moment, then dialed another number. "It's me. Trace this number. I need to know who it belongs to." He ended the call and turned back to Sophie. "From now on, you shouldn't go anywhere alone. If they've set their sights on you, they won't stop here." Sophie was momentarily taken aback by his unexpected concern. Was this really Julian Cross, the cold, detached CEO who had never once acknowledged her presence before? "I'm fine," she said, trying to sound firm. "No, you're not," Julian stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I don't like owing people. You helped me, now it's my turn to make sure you're safe." Sophie looked into his unwavering gaze, realizing there was no point in protesting. "Fine," she sighed. "But I'm not someone who needs protection." Julian's lips curled into the faintest hint of amusement. "I don't doubt that." 30 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the hotel. Julian opened the passenger door, motioning for Sophie to get in. She hesitated for a moment before finally stepping inside. As the car glided through the night, silence filled the space between them, calm yet oddly charged. "Are you always this reckless?" Julian finally broke the silence. Sophie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't think helping someone counted as reckless." "Helping someone in a high-stakes blackmail scheme isn't exactly wise," Julian remarked, his voice low and controlled. Sophie let out a quiet laugh. "Then why did you do something just as foolish?" Julian raised an eyebrow, momentarily surprised by her question. But instead of being annoyed, he simply chuckled. "Because I don't let anyone control me." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Then we have that in common." Julian glanced at her, a flicker of intrigue in his gray eyes. For the first time, he truly paid attention to this seemingly ordinary employee. Maybe Sophie Lane wasn't as ordinary as he had once thought. When the car stopped in front of Sophie's apartment complex, Julian didn't let her out immediately. He looked at her, his tone serious. "If anything unusual happens, call me right away." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Do I even have your number?" Without a word, Julian took her phone, swiftly dialed his own number, and left a missed call. "Now you do." Sophie glanced at the screen and smiled. "All right, boss. But I don't think I'll need your protection." Julian said nothing, watching her step out of the car, his expression unreadable. He didn't believe in coincidences. An ordinary employee just happened to be there at the exact moment he was in danger? A threatening message arriving right after? There was something about Sophie Lane that he didn't fully understand, and he was determined to find out. Sophie shut the door to her apartment, sank into the couch, and exhaled deeply. The tension from earlier still lingered. Her phone vibrated, a new message. "Unknown number, I told you to be careful." "You didn't listen, did you, Sophie Lane?" A chill ran down her spine. She shot up from the couch and double-checked the locks. She wasn't easily scared, but this message felt different. Felt like someone was watching her. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Julian. "Julian, if anything happens, call me immediately." Sophie hesitated. She didn't want to seem weak, but maybe Julian was right. She made a decision and sent a message back. "Sophie, I just got another message from an unknown number." Less than a minute later, her phone rang. "What did it say?" Julian's voice was low, carrying an edge of danger. "They told me to be careful." Silence. A beat passed. Then, "Open your door. I'm downstairs." Sophie's eyes widened. She stepped onto her balcony, peering down, and sure enough, Julian's car was parked on the street below. Was he really planning to stay there all night? She sighed, but still unlocked the door, letting him in. "Don't you think this is a bit much?" she asked, arms crossed as he entered her small living room. Julian shrugged. "I don't like owing people. You helped me, now it's my turn to help you." Sophie studied him, realizing something. This wasn't just about protection. Julian could claim he didn't like debts, but it seemed he also didn't like anyone interfering with what he considered his. And somehow she had become part of his world. The next morning, when Sophie arrived at the office, something felt off. People were whispering, watching her. She frowned and hurried to her desk. The moment she opened her laptop, she understood why. A rumor was spreading online. Julian Cross's personal assistant spent the night at his apartment. Sophie froze. How had this gotten out so quickly? And more importantly, who leaked it? She clenched her phone. Julian needed to know. But as she entered his office, she realized he already did. He was waiting for her, a folder on his desk. Without a word, he slid it toward her. "Sit down, Sophie. We need to talk." Heart pounding, she opened the folder. Inside were photos of her leaving the hotel, standing beside Julian, getting into his car. Someone had been watching her. And this time, she knew for sure. She was caught in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. After the tense events of the past few days, Julian decided to take Sophie out to dinner as a way of thanking her. But more than that, he wanted to understand her. First, Sophie was hesitant. Though Julian was her boss, he was also a dangerously charismatic man. Till eventually she agreed. The restaurant Julian chose was on the top floor of a luxurious building, offering a breathtaking view of the city lights. As they took their seats, Sophie maintained a safe distance. "I didn't think a busy CEO like you had time to take an employee out to dinner," she said, raising an eyebrow. Leaning back in his chair, Julian gave her a faint smile. "I'm not taking an employee to dinner. I'm taking Sophie Lane." She paused at the way he phrased it, then let out a dry chuckle. "So I'm special tonight?" "Perhaps." Julian's eyes held a flicker of amusement. Throughout dinner, he didn't just talk about work. He asked about her interests, her dreams. He realized that Sophie wasn't someone who opened up easily, but with each answer, he caught glimpses of a different woman. Someone who had been deeply hurt before. "You don't trust people easily, do you?" Julian asked suddenly. Sophie hesitated. She didn't like talking about her past. but something about his gaze made her feel like she could share. "I used to trust someone," she said quietly, "and he betrayed me." Julian narrowed his eyes. "He?" Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "Someone I once loved. I thought he was my whole world, until I found out I was nothing more than a pawn to him." Julian was silent for a moment. Sophie noticed how tightly he gripped his wine glass. "He didn't deserve you," Julian said, his voice low. Sophie arched a brow. "You say that like you know me. Maybe I'd like to." His gaze softened in a way she had never seen before. For a brief moment, Sophie felt her heart skip a beat. She couldn't deny it. Julian wasn't as arrogant as she had once thought. He had the decisiveness of a CEO, but he also had a sincerity she hadn't expected. But before she could dwell on that thought, a text message flashed across her phone screen. "Unknown number. If you get involved, it won't be easy to walk away. Be careful, Sophie." A chill ran down her spine. She knew then the nightmare wasn't over. After dinner, Sophie returned home exhausted and quickly drifted into a deep, heavy sleep. But when she woke up, a sharp pain shot through her head. She found herself bound to a chair in an abandoned warehouse. A dim, flickering light bulb cast eerie shadows around the room. A man stepped forward, smirking. "Good morning, Mississippi Lane." Sophie narrowed her eyes at him. "What do you want?" "Not you." Julian Cross. His smirk widened. "How much do you think he's worth? How much will he pay to save you?" Sophie's blood boiled. "You think I'm his weakness?" The man let out a cruel laugh. "Aren't you? If not, then why did Julian come here himself?" Sophie froze. She glanced toward the grimy window, and sure enough, outside stood a familiar figure. Julian was there. Alone. He stepped into the warehouse, his expression darkening the moment he saw Sophie tied up. "Let her go," he said coldly. The leader of the group folded his arms, grinning. "Easily done. Just transfer the money to our account and she walks out of here unharmed." Julian tossed a USB drive onto the table. "Here's proof of all your illegal transactions. If I don't walk out of here in 5 minutes, this goes straight to the police." Criminal stiffened. The leader clenched his jaw and pulled out a gun. But before he could react, Sophie suddenly lunged forward. She had been secretly cutting through the ropes. With a swift kick, she knocked the gun from his hand, sending him staggering back. "Julian, run!" she shouted. But Julian didn't run. He lunged forward, taking down one thug with a single punch. Chaos erupted as the others charged in, but Julian and Sophie moved in perfect sync, taking them down one by one. At last, only the leader remained. He stumbled back, fear flashing in his eyes. "You think you've won," he snarled. But just then, sirens wailed and the police stormed in. Julian smirked, cold. "No. Now we've won." Once the criminals were arrested, Julian led Sophie outside. She turned to him, emotions swirling in her gaze. "You really risked your life for me?" Julian met her eyes, his hand gently brushing against her cheek. "Sophie, you're not just my employee anymore," he said, his voice husky. "You're someone I want to protect for a lifetime." Sophie froze. "What do you mean?" Julian smiled before pulling her closer, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. She stiffened in shock, but then slowly she closed her eyes and kissed him back. Maybe everything that had happened wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. She had once said she didn't believe in love, but right now, as she looked into Julian's eyes, she knew she had found someone she could trust again. The next morning, Sophie woke up early, her mind still spinning from everything that had happened. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. But the danger, the emotions, all of it had been real. She got ready and arrived at work, trying to stay invisible again. But that plan failed the moment she stepped through the lobby. Everyone was staring. Whispers followed her down the hall like a shadow. "That's her, the one from the photos. I heard she spent the night at Julian Cross's place. She's not just some assistant anymore. Sophie kept her head down, her heart pounding. This wasn't what she wanted. She never asked to be in the spotlight. When she reached her desk, she found an envelope waiting for her. No name. No note. Just a single photograph inside, one of her and Julian leaving the restaurant the night before. Another warning. Sophie didn't wait. She stormed up to Julian's office. His assistant tried to stop her, but Julian's voice came from inside. Let her in. She entered, slamming the photo onto his desk. They're still watching me. Julian looked at the image, his jaw tightening. You're not safe here anymore. So what now? She asked, her voice trembling. Do I disappear? Quit? Run? No, he said firmly. You stay. You fight. With me. Sophie stared at him, unsure whether to feel terrified or protected. Why are you doing this? Because I don't want to lose you, Julian replied. Not now. Not after everything. Sophie didn't respond. She sat down slowly, her hands still shaking. Julian reached across the desk, placing his hand over hers. I've contacted my legal team. Security's being doubled. And I've hired a private investigator to track whoever's behind these threats. She nodded silently. A part of her wanted to run, but another part didn't want to let go of what they had started to build. That night, Julian drove her home himself. But this time, he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped into her apartment, looked around the space, and said, Pack a bag. You're staying at my place until this is over. Sophie raised an eyebrow. You think that's necessary? I think it's safer, he replied. And if it makes you uncomfortable, I'll sleep on the couch. She gave him a dry look. You? Sleep on a couch? Julian smirked. For you? I'd consider it. Against her better judgment, she laughed. And for the first time in days, she felt something close to normal. That night, she sat by the window in Julian's penthouse, gazing at the skyline. He joined her silently, handing her a cup of tea. You don't talk much about your past, he said softly. There's not much to say, she murmured. Just a series of people pretending to care. Julian looked at her. I'm not pretending. Sophie glanced at him. His eyes didn't lie. But before either of them could speak again, her phone buzzed. Unknown number, you think it's over? It's only just begun. Julian saw the message and took her phone without a word. They're getting desperate, he said. Sophie nodded. So what now? Julian leaned in, his voice quiet but certain. Now we stop hiding. We find out who's behind this, and we end it. As Sophie looked into his determined eyes, she realized that this wasn't the end of her nightmare. It was just the beginning of a far more dangerous game. But this time she wasn't alone.